Question 1. How large is the buffer? This question is irrelevant. The two relevant questions are: how large is the directly addressable buffer? And the answer is 60,000 milliseconds, the maximum of delay, a whole minute. The second relevant question is: how much of the buffer's content can I hear? And the answer is 60,000 milliseconds plus grain length, which again can be up to 60,000 milliseconds, makes all in all 2 minutes. The grain squares in the grain view window don't move along the delay axis further than 60,000 milliseconds because the left border of those squares symbolizes the beginning of the grains, which is determined by the delay parameter. The length of the grain squares along the time axis of the grain view window plus their left border, their starting point, show the whole length of audible sound from the buffer. There will be a special video about the grain view window later in this series. It will be the next video indeed. Nevertheless, I'd like to lead your attention to the fact that the existence of sound above 60,000 milliseconds is shown along the delay axis even if you can't address it directly. Question 2. How much of a sound, live play or running sequencer, is loaded into the buffer when I click the manual button to trigger the buffer? Well, it depends on the amount of delay and on the length of the grains. The schedule shows some approximate figures I have measured in some experiments. You see that there is a base amount depending only on the length of the grains, for example 600 milliseconds at a grain length of 100 milliseconds, and this base amount is simply added to the delay time. The result is the amount of sound loaded into the buffer. Question 3. How much of a sound, live play or running sequencer, is loaded into the buffer when auto is activated? The whole buffer is filled bit by bit. The sound streams into the buffer and fills it up. When I deactivate auto again, the last 60,000 milliseconds before deactivating are directly addressable, and up to 60,000 milliseconds more are audible according to the length of the grains. Remember question 1. It is not important what grain length was adjusted while auto was active and the buffer was being filled up, but what grain length you adjust when you are listening to the buffer's content. Question 4. When there is sound from playing live or from a running sequencer and you trigger the buffer by clicking manual, the regular live sound from your live play or from the sequencer is heard or used for the adjusted processings by CrusherX for some seconds, and then suddenly the sound gets stuck. How long is the time between clicking manual and the sound getting, let's say, fixed? Well, it depends only on the length of the grains. Here are some figures again, gained by experimenting a little. There is no influence of delay or birth rate. Question 5. What happens when there is a sound file loaded in the buffer, no live playing is going on, no sequencer is running, but I nevertheless click the manual button? Answer: the sound in the buffer is pushed ahead and replaced by silence. The amount of the displacement corresponds to question 2. So, with, for example, a delay of 0 and a grain length of 100 milliseconds, the sound is pushed ahead by about 600 milliseconds. The first 600 milliseconds of the buffer's content are silent now. If I then change delay to 600 milliseconds so that I can hear the beginning of the sound and click manual again, the sound is pushed ahead by 600 milliseconds delay time plus 600 milliseconds basic postponement. The sound in the buffer begins now at 1800 milliseconds, 2 times 600 milliseconds postponement plus 600 milliseconds previous beginning point. Question 6. The same question as question 5, but this time a live play is going on or a sequencer is running. Well, the answer is the same, but for the fact that the time span the sound in the buffer is pushed ahead by is filled with a live play or the sequencer's tune now and not with silence. Question 7. What happens when one of the quantise modes, trigger or grain trigger, is active? A sound file has been loaded into the buffer and the sequencer of my DAW is running without producing any sound. There is nothing programmed in the sequencer. There will be a special video about the quantise modes later in this series, so only a short answer here. Every time the sequencer passes a quantise point, for example a quarter note, the filling of the buffer is triggered. According to questions 2 and 5, the actual content of the buffer is pushed further on every time such a quantise point is passed by the sequencer. But there is no sound being produced by the sequencer, so the first milliseconds of the sequencer's content, of the buffer's content, are filled up with silence. Without changing delay, I hear the beginning of the loaded sound only once, only the first time the sequencer passes a quantise point. After that, I don't hear anything anymore as long as I don't change delay. Question 8. How can I adjust the manual trigger level and how can I optically control this level? The threshold of the trigger process can be adjusted using the slider or the wheel in the trigger panel, or by adjusting the level of the smaller inner columns of the in-L and in-R level meters. Both methods work synchronous and parallel. The level meters deliver the optical control of the threshold as well as the actual relation of the input level and the threshold. Question 9. How much of the buffer's content is actually saved when I click the Save button? Well, it depends on 3 factors: delay, grain length, and modulation depth. I've done some measuring and I've got these approximate results shown in the following tables. At a given grain length, here it is 100 milliseconds, the amount of delay adds 1:1 to the amount of sound CrusherX will save from the buffer. 100 milliseconds more of delay corresponds to 100 seconds more of stored sound. At a given amount of delay, here 0, the grain length adds disproportionally to the amount of sound which will be saved from the buffer. At a grain length between 10 and 100, the amount of saved sound grows exponentially. With grain length longer than 100, the relation gets linear. Per every 100 milliseconds more of grain length, the amount of stored sound grows by 500 milliseconds. The depth of modulation adds to the main parameter. Increasing the modulation depth of delay adds 1:1. Increasing the modulation depth of the grain length adds 1:5. One example based on the shown tables. With a grain length of 500 milliseconds and a modulation depth of 200 milliseconds, modulation mode sine wave, and a delay of 1000 milliseconds and a modulation depth of 300 milliseconds, the amount of sound saved from the buffer will approximately be grain length 500 milliseconds plus modulation 200 milliseconds results in 700 milliseconds, corresponding to 3607 milliseconds of stored sound, plus delay 1000 milliseconds plus modulation 300 milliseconds results in 1300 milliseconds, corresponding to 1300 milliseconds of stored sound. All in all, 3670 milliseconds plus 1300 milliseconds equals 4970 milliseconds of sound will be saved from the buffer, will be saved from the sound in the buffer. Approximate. Question 10. How much of the sound in the buffer above 60,000 milliseconds is shown in the grain view window? If the length of the grains is adjusted to less than around 20,000 milliseconds, the grain view window shows the buffer's content up to about 80,000 milliseconds, with a delay maximum of 60,000. Increasing the grain's length to more than 20,000 milliseconds lets you see even more of the buffer's content. With a maximum grain length of 60,000 milliseconds, the grain view window shows up to 120,000 milliseconds of the buffer's content. The next video in this series is going to be about the grain view window, and so thank you for today. Thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing, liking and sharing, and enjoy your life.